The canal had always felt like a long, thin vein running through the country's body. Quiet, overlooked, keeping things alive without anyone really noticing. I was moored just outside Braunston when the world ended, my narrowboat, Gray Heron, nudging the bank with the patience of something that had learned not to expect urgency from people anymore. I woke to silence so complete it felt engineered. No distant traffic hum, no dog barking from a towpath cottage. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. The boat's steel roof was cold under my palm as I pushed myself up from the bunk, breath fogging in the cabin air. My stove had gone out overnight. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should have banked the coals better. Then my phone buzzed. No signal bars, just notifications queued up like panicked knocks on a locked door. Videos that wouldn't load. Headlines truncated mid-sentence. Riots in unknown illness spread. Stay indoors. I didn't need the rest. I'd spent enough time online to recognize the shape of a collapse. I put the kettle on anyway, because routine is a lie we tell ourselves when reality gets too large. The kettle never boiled. The power cut out with a soft, final click, like someone turning off a light in a room they never planned to enter again. I stood there listening to the cooling metal and felt something in my chest shift, not fear yet, but recognition. The canals had taught me that when systems fail, they don't announce it, they just stop. I stepped out onto the stern deck. The canal stretched ahead of me, mirror flat, reflecting a sky the color of old pewter. Locks lay empty in both directions. Usually, you'd hear someone, anyone, working paddles, cursing stiff windlasses, laughing. Today there was nothing. That was when I heard the scream. It came from the village, one sharp, tearing sound cut short as if someone had reached out and physically closed a mouth. I waited for a second scream. It didn't come. I untied Gray Heron with shaking hands. The engine coughed like an old smoker when I turned the key, then caught. The vibration traveled up through the deck into my bones. Diesel smoke curled into the cold air. I eased the throttle forward and the boat began to move, slow and deliberate, as if unaware that urgency had suddenly become a thing. As we rounded the bend toward Braunston Marina, I saw the first body. He was face down at the water's edge, one arm trailing into the canal. At first glance, he looked drunk, another boater who'd slipped. But the water around him was dark with more than shadow, and when the boat's wake nudged him, his head lolled in a way no living neck should allow. I cut the engine. The silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. I stared at him for a long time, waiting for him to move. When he didn't, I told myself I should help. That's what you do. That's what people do. Then he twitched. It wasn't dramatic, just a small, ugly jerk of the shoulder. His fingers clawed weakly at the muddy bank, nails tearing. His head rolled toward me, and I saw his face gray, slack, mouth working soundlessly like a fish hauled out of water. I backed away from the tiller. He dragged himself forward with impossible persistence, broken leg folding wrong beneath him. His eyes were wrong too, not glazed focused entirely on me. No, I whispered, though I didn't know what I was refusing. The boat drifted, current pulling us apart by inches. The man-thing reached the edge of the water and tried to stand. He failed, fell, and crawled again, teeth clacking together hard enough that I heard it across the canal. I restarted the engine and gunned it. Gray Heron surged forward, stern swinging wide. The prop churned water into froth, and for a split second I was terrified he'd grab the rudder, pull us back. But the distance grew, and then he was behind me, shrinking into just another shape on the bank. I didn't slow until the marina was well out of sight. By midday, the canals had become my road, my refuge. My mistake. Smoke rose from places it shouldn't. I passed a waterside pub with its doors flung open and nobody inside. A pushbike lay abandoned on the towpath, panniers still full. Every lock I approached stood open, gates yawning like mouths left open mid-sentence. I told myself this was good luck. Fewer delays. I told myself a lot of things. The first real problem came at Hillmorton Locks. Normally, you queue there. Boats nose to tail, people hopping off with windlasses, chatting while the chambers fill. Today, there were boats, but they were wrong. 2 narrowboats sat half-sunk against the lock wall, ropes tangled, paint scraped raw. A cruiser had rammed the bottom gates and stayed there, engine still idling, churning water pointlessly. And on the towpath, they stood. 6 of them, maybe 7. They were human ones. That was obvious in the way they wore clothes badly chosen for the cold, in the way one still had a fluorescent vest hanging open. They swayed, heads twitching toward the sound of my engine, mouths opening and closing as if tasting the air. I cut the throttle immediately. The engine noise dropped, but it was too late. One of them lurched forward, tripped, then scrambled upright with a speed that made my stomach drop. They began to move together, converging on the lock edge. I reversed. The boat responded sluggishly, stern swinging toward the bank. My pulse roared in my ears. I fumbled with the tiller, trying not to overcorrect. Hands slapped the steel hull as the first of them reached the water's edge. They didn't hesitate. They waded straight in, clothes darkening as the canal soaked them. One slipped and went under, resurfacing moments later, arms windmilling. They made no sound beyond wet splashes and the occasional clack of teeth. I slammed the throttle forward. Gray herons surged ahead, passing the lock by inches. Fingers scraped along the gunwale. Something grabbed my jacket and tore it half off before losing purchase. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Only when the lock was a distant shape behind me did I slow, heart hammering so hard it hurt. That was when it hit me fully. The canals weren't empty because people had fled. They were empty because the canals weren't where people ran. They ran to cars, to motorways, to cities, and the canals slow, meandering, forgotten, had simply been left behind. By nightfall, I found a stretch of countryside so quiet, it felt like another world. I moored in the middle of nowhere, tied up beneath bare trees whose branches clawed at the sky. I didn't light the stove. I didn't turn on a single lamp. I ate cold beans straight from the tin, crouched on the floor with my back against the hull, knife in my hand like it might somehow make sense of things. Outside, something moved along the towpath. Footsteps, uneven, dragging. They passed without stopping. I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the water lap softly against the steel, thinking about how I'd chosen this life because it was simple, because it stripped things down to what you needed: fuel, water, food, patience. I realized, as dawn crept pale and thin through the portholes, that I might have chosen the only home left in Britain that could still move without roads, without power, without permission. And for the first time since the scream that morning, I felt something like hope. It didn't feel good. It felt dangerous. Morning didn't bring clarity. It brought fog. It crept off the canal like breath from a sleeping animal, rolling low and thick, swallowing the banks until the world shrank to a narrow corridor of gray water and darker gray sky. I untied Gray Heron without ceremony and let her idle forward, engine kept low, every sense straining. The fog changed the sound of things. Water lapped louder. Birds, when they finally dared to speak, sounded closer than they were. And every now and then, there came a noise I couldn't place. A soft splash, a distant thud, each one sending my heart racing. I passed through the morning slowly, letting the canal dictate my pace. That had always been the rule. Fight it, and you make mistakes. By midday, the fog burned off, revealing fields soaked in winter light. Sheep clustered near the towpath, watching me pass with blank, unblinking interest. They didn't run. They didn't panic. I wondered, briefly, if animals knew something we didn't, if they could sense that whatever sickness had claimed us wasn't meant for them. The thought didn't last. I reached a small water point near a derelict wharf and made a decision that scared me more than the zombies had. I stopped. The tank gauge was dipping lower than I liked, and while I could have pressed on, the canals are unforgiving when you misjudge water. Running dry doesn't just mean thirst, it means no washing, no flushing, no ability to stay clean enough to avoid infection if you get hurt. In the old world, you could always find another tap. In this one, who knew? I stepped onto the towpath with my windlass clipped to my belt and the knife still in my hand. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. Somewhere, far off, something banged metal on metal, repeating every few seconds. Wind, maybe, or something caught in a loop. I didn't go to investigate. The water point worked. Miraculously, blessedly, it worked. Clear water gushed from the hose into my filler, loud enough to make me wince. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the curve of the canal, the hedgerows, the empty wharf buildings with their broken windows like missing teeth. Nothing came. When the tank was full, I didn't linger. I coiled the hose, stepped back aboard, and pushed off with a sense of relief so strong it almost made my knees weak. The engine thrummed, steady and familiar, and Gray Heron slid back into motion like she'd never known another purpose. It was later that day, rounding a bend near Rugby, that I saw smoke rising straight and black against the sky. Not drifting, not dissipating. A fire being fed. I slowed to a crawl. The canal here ran close to an industrial estate. Warehouses crouched like sleeping animals beside the water. One of them burned fiercely, flames punching through the roof. Cars were scattered haphazardly in the yard, doors open, windows smashed, and on the towpath, 3 figures moved with intent. They weren't zombies. They walked too smoothly, purposefully. One of them turned at the sound of my engine, raised a hand, and waved. I didn't wave back. I kept the throttle steady and my eyes forward, pretending badly that I hadn't seen them. My pulse hammered as the boat crept closer. They stepped nearer the edge, peering at me with open interest. One of them held something long and dark that might have been a crowbar. "Oi!" someone shouted. "Boat!" I considered gunning the engine. I considered cutting it entirely and drifting past. In the end, habit betrayed me. I slowed, just a fraction. "Where you heading?" the man called, smiling too broadly. "Nowhere," I replied, voice tight. "Just passing through." He laughed. "Ain't we all?" The other 2 moved now, spreading slightly, casual but deliberate, blocking the towpath, blocking escape. I realized, too late, that this was a toll. The canals might avoid the hordes, but people adapted quickly. "Got food?" he asked. "Fuel? Anything you can spare?" I thought of my tins stacked neatly under the bunk, of the diesel gauge already lower than I liked, of how alone I was. "No," I said. He tilted his head, considering. Shame. The crowbar came up. I reacted without thinking. I slammed the throttle forward and yanked the tiller hard. The prop bit the water and Gray Heron lurched, stern swinging wide. The man closest to the edge stumbled back as the boat surged past, wake slapping hard against the bank. Something clanged against the hull. Another impact, dull and heavy. I heard a shout of anger, Then a stone smashed against the cabin side, cracking a porthole but not breaking through. I didn't slow until the smoke was far behind me and my hands were shaking too badly to hold the tiller steady. That night, I moored under a bridge, steel belly pressed into shadow. I hung a blanket over the cracked porthole and wedged a chair under the hatch. I listened to footsteps pass overhead just one set, then another, and held my breath until the sounds faded. It was my first real lesson. Zombies were dangerous because they were relentless. People were dangerous because they could choose. Days blurred together after that. I learned to move early and stop late. I learned to avoid towns entirely, skirting their edges like a guilty thought. I scavenged when I could, an abandoned boat here, a looted but not emptied shop there, always quick, always quiet. At a lonely lock flight near Hawkesbury, I found a body pinned between gates, crushed during some desperate, failed attempt to escape. I worked the paddles with shaking arms, eyes fixed anywhere but on the ruined shape at my feet. When the chamber filled and the water lifted the corpse free, it floated, bumping gently against the wall like it might ask for help. I left it there. At another mooring, I found a dog. It sat patiently beside a narrowboat that had run aground, lead still clipped to a bollard. The boat's doors stood open, interior dark and silent. The dog, a lurcher, ribs showing, watched me approach without barking, tail wagging weakly. I didn't touch the boat. I did, after a long hesitation, unclip the lead. The dog followed me back to Gray Heron without question. I named him Moss because of the green flecks in his coat and because naming things makes them real. He slept curled against the stove that night, head on his paws, eyes closed in absolute trust. I lay awake beside him, knife within reach, listening to his breathing and thinking about how small the world had become. By the time winter deepened, I had a plan. The canals ran everywhere. Cities fed into them like arteries, but there were places, long, lonely stretches, where the water threaded through nothing but fields and forests. If I could reach one of those, find a spot defensible and hidden, I might last. I didn't know yet that the canals, like all roads, eventually bring you back to people. And people, I was learning, never truly go away. The countryside north of Coventry felt emptied of time. Days passed where I saw no one living, and only the occasional wandering dead solitary figures drifting along towpaths as if following some long-forgotten errand. Moss learned quickly. He'd stiffen before I saw them, ears pricking, low growl rumbling in his chest. When that happened, I slowed, cut the engine, and let the boat glide past in near silence, trusting the wind and water more than my own judgment. Winter tightened its grip. Ice rimmed the canal edges each morning, thin but spreading. The boat handled it well enough. Gray Heron had pushed through worse, but every scrape of ice against steel sounded louder than it should have. Every crack felt like a signal flare. I started marking places in my head. Good moorings, bad ones. Bridges with wide sightlines. Bends that hid danger. The canals stopped being romantic and became tactical. It was on a quiet stretch near Atherstone that I found the floating body. At first, I thought it was a log. It bobbed lazily, turning with the current, caught against a stand of reeds. Moss growled before I registered what I was seeing. Clothes, hair, a face half submerged, skin waxy and pale. I slowed, heart sinking. The body twitched. I reversed immediately, engine churning water into foam. The thing came upright with awful suddenness, water pouring from its mouth as it clawed uselessly at the reeds. It didn't scream. None of them ever did. It just watched me go, eyes fixed, arms reaching until the distance grew too wide. I didn't stop shaking for an hour. That night, I made camp in the middle of a long pound with no easy bank access. I tied up only enough to keep from drifting, lights off, stove barely breathing. Moss lay at the bow, chin on the deck, watching the darkness. That was when I heard the splash. Not close, not loud, but deliberate. I froze. Another splash followed, then another, slow and rhythmic, like someone wading carefully. I eased myself up, peering through the front window. The water ahead rippled, widening circles spreading across the surface. A hand broke through. They climbed out of the canal like drowned memories, water streaming from them, clothes heavy and dark. 3 of them, then a 4th. They moved with purpose, drawn by something I couldn't hear, but they could. The boat rocked slightly as one bumped the hull. Moss snarled, low and vicious. I grabbed the shaft from its hook and jammed it through the front doors, bracing them shut. The first impact came hard enough to rattle the glass. Fingers scraped, nails shrieked against steel. I backed away, heart hammering, and did the only thing that made sense. I started the engine. The noise exploded into the night. The dead responded instantly, slamming themselves against the hull, teeth clacking. I shoved the throttle forward and felt the boat strain against the ropes. One snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The other followed a second later. Gray Heron lurched forward, dragging one of them briefly before it lost its grip and tumbled back into the water. I didn't look back. I ran until the engine overheated warning flickered on and the sky began to pale with false dawn. Only then did I slow, breath coming in ragged gasps, hands numb on the tiller. After that, I stopped trusting stillness. Movement, I learned, was safety. Stagnation drew attention, smells, sounds, patterns. I kept going, deeper into the web of canals, choosing routes that led nowhere in particular. I passed through Birmingham's outskirts in a long, sleepless push, factories looming like dead giants, graffiti screaming messages that no longer mattered. It was there, beneath a flyover, that I met the woman. Her boat was moored badly, bow skewed into the bank, ropes frayed, smoke curled thin and blue from her chimney. I should have passed, I knew that. But Moss barked, once, sharp, not a warning, a greeting. She stood on the towpath with a bow in her hand, arrow already nocked. Her hair was cropped short, face lean, eyes sharp and assessing. "Don't come closer," she called. "I won't," I replied, stopping the boat well short. "I'm just passing." She didn't lower the bow. Everyone says that. "Fair," I said. "I can go." We studied each other across the water, 2 survivors measuring risk. Finally, she relaxed the bowstring a fraction. "You alone?" she asked. "Me and the dog." She glanced at Moss, who sat obediently at my side, tail thumping once. Something in her expression softened. "I'm Ellie," she said. "That's my boat, or what's left of it." "What happened?" I asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "People, always people." We talked like that for a while, voices low, distance maintained. She'd been on the canals before the outbreak too, but she'd lost her partner at a lock further south. Her boat had taken damage during a fight she barely escaped. "Engines shot," she admitted. "I've been stuck here 3 days." I thought of my plan, of solitude, of how thin my own chances were. "Stick with me," I said before I could talk myself out of it. "At least until you can move again." She studied me for a long time. Then she nodded. We worked together in careful silence, towing her boat to a safer stretch, rigging a temporary fix. That night, we moored bow to stern, boats lashed together like they might draw strength from proximity. For the first time since the world ended, I slept for more than an hour at a stretch. The days that followed changed the shape of things. Ellie was cautious, capable, and carried her grief like a sharpened blade. We shared watch, shared food, shared stories in fragments. She taught me how to shoot the bow. I taught her how to coax another mile out of a failing engine. It felt almost like living. That, of course, was when things went wrong. We approached a flight of locks near the edge of the Black Country, and the smell hit us first rot, thick and sweet. Bodies clustered in the chambers below, jammed against the gates, bloated and tangled. Dozens of them, and on the towpath above, fresh footprints. Ellie met my eyes. "We're not alone," she said. The canals had carried us this far. Now they were narrowing, forcing us towards something waiting with open arms. We didn't go through the lock flight. That decision saved our lives, at least for a while. Ellie spotted the footprints first, fresh and purposeful, cutting back and forth along the towpath above the locks, not the aimless wandering of the dead. These were people moving with intent, stopping, turning, doubling back. Trapping the locks had been deliberate. "Ambush," she said quietly. I nodded. The canals had taught me to read signs most people ignored. The dead jammed into the chambers weren't accidental. Someone had herded them there, knowing any boat trying to pass would be forced to stop, to work paddles, to linger. "Back up?" I suggested. "Too obvious," she replied. "They'll hear the engine." We drifted instead, letting the boat ease against the bank in a patch of scrub. Ellie moved like she'd rehearsed this, stepping off with bow in hand, melting into the trees. I followed more clumsily, moss at heel, every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot in my head. From our hiding place, we watched. 3 men emerged on the far side of the flight, rifles slung casually, confidence in their posture. They laughed about something, one of them kicking a body back into the lock chamber with lazy cruelty. Another peered down the canal, scanning for movement. "Canal pirates," Ellie murmured. "They've been getting bolder." "How many?" I asked. She shook her head. "Enough." We waited until they moved on, then slipped back to the boats and pushed off silently, choosing a sidearm that looped away into reed-choked isolation. It cost us time, fuel, and a clean route, but it kept us breathing. That night, tension clung to us like damp. We moored beneath overhanging trees, branches scraping softly against steel. Ellie took first watch, bow across her knees. I lay on my bunk listening to the canal breathe. Moss curled tight against my legs. Sometime after midnight, Moss growled. Not loud, not frantic, a warning so low I felt it more than heard it. Ellie was at the door in an instant, eyes wide. Footsteps, slow, careful. I held my breath. A shadow passed across the cabin window, blocking the faint starlight. Then another. Whispers followed, urgent. Hushed. Ellie drew her bow. The door handle twitched. I moved without thinking, slamming my shoulder against the door from the inside as it began to open. The impact sent a startled grunt through the wood. Ellie loosed an arrow through the narrow gap. There was a sharp cry, pain and surprise mixed. "Move," she hissed. I started the engine as hands hammered against the hull. One of them tried to climb aboard from the bow, fingers scrabbling for purchase. Moss lunged, snapping, teeth sinking into fabric and flesh. The man screamed and fell back into the water with a splash. Ellie fired again. Another scream. Then chaos shouting, gunshots cracking the night open. A bullet punched through the cabin side, showering us with splinters. I gunned the throttle. Gray heron tore free of the bank, branches whipping past as we surged forward. The canal twisted, narrow and dark, but I didn't slow. Bullets slapped water behind us, sending up white plumes. Then the bend took us, and the night swallowed the sound. We didn't stop until dawn painted the sky bruised purple and gold. Both of us were shaking, adrenaline bleeding away, into bone-deep exhaustion. "They followed us," I said, voice hoarse. Ellie nodded. "They'll keep trying." That changed things. From then on, every mooring was temporary. Every stop was a risk. We moved together seamlessly now, an unspoken understanding between us. Ellie scouted ahead with the bow when things felt wrong. I learned to idle the engine so quietly it barely whispered. Moss became our early warning system, ears tuned to sounds we'd miss. Food grew tighter. We rationed without discussion, stretching tins with rice, supplementing with what we could forage. Ellie caught a rabbit with the bow one afternoon, and we cooked it quietly. Smoke dispersed, the smell almost unbearable in its promise of normality. As winter deepened, ice began to choke the canal in earnest. We broke through it slowly, the hull groaning in protest. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every mile became work. That was when Ellie got hurt. It was stupid. Simple. A slip on an icy lock gate while we were checking a bypass route. She went down hard, twisting awkwardly. The crack echoed louder than it should have. Her ankle swelled immediately, angry and wrong. She bit back a scream, jaw clenched, eyes bright with pain. "Don't stop moving," she said through gritted teeth. I carried her back to the boat, heart pounding. A broken ankle in this world wasn't just an injury, it was a countdown. We splinted it as best we could, bound it tight. She refused painkillers, saving them for when it's worse. For days, she stayed below, moving only when necessary. I took on everything: locks, watch, scavenging fatigue settling deep into my bones. Moss barely left her side. The canal ahead narrowed into a stretch I knew well, a long, isolated run through cuttings and woodland, with few access points and no villages for miles. It had been one of my planned refuges. "We can make a stand there," I told her. "Let you heal." Ellie looked at me for a long time. "Stands turn into graves," she said softly. "Running turns into one too," I replied. We didn't argue further. We reached the cutting at dusk. Sheer earth walls rose on either side, canal hemmed in and quiet. I moored beneath a canopy of bare branches, hidden from any casual glance. For the first time in weeks, we allowed ourselves a fire that burned a little brighter. It felt like peace, which was how I knew it wouldn't last. Sometime in the night, Moss lifted his head and growled, and from the far end of the cutting, a sound drifted toward us, dozens of feet shuffling in unison, drawn by our warmth, our light, our mistaken belief that we'd found safety. The canal had narrowed. So had our options. The sound rolled through the cutting like distant surf, soft at first, then unmistakable, shuffling feet, wet, dragging steps. The dead were coming down the canal towpath, funneled by the high earth walls straight toward us. Ellie sat up in the bunk, pale but alert. "How many?" I listened, counting heartbeats between impacts. Too many to fight, too many to slip past quietly. "Enough," I said. The engine was cold. Starting it now would be loud an invitation, but staying meant being trapped against the bank with nowhere to run. The cutting was a corridor. Once they reached us, there'd be no flanking, no retreat. "Untie," Ellie said. "Slow, no light." I moved by memory, hands numb, working the ropes loose without letting them slap the steel. Moss stood rigid, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The first shapes emerged, silhouettes against the paler sky beyond the cutting. One stumbled, then righted itself. Another bumped into it. Then another, momentum building as more pressed forward from behind. I turned the key. The engine coughed once. I froze. Ellie held her breath. It coughed again, louder. The dead reacted instantly. Heads snapped toward us, arms lifted, The shuffling became a rush. The engine caught. I slammed the throttle forward, not caring about noise anymore. Gray herons surged ahead, ice cracking loudly against the bow as we plowed through the frozen surface. The cutting magnified every sound engine roar, breaking ice, the chorus of the dead as they surged along the bank, some slipping, some falling into the canal and clawing their way back out. One dropped straight into the water ahead of us, surfaced just in time to be struck by the bow and shoved under. It didn't come back up. We burst out of the cutting into open countryside, moonlight silvering the fields. I didn't slow until the canal widened and the towpath fell away into darkness. Only then did I ease back, chest burning, hands shaking so hard I had to grip the tiller with both of them. Ellie sagged back against the bulkhead. That could have been it. But it wasn't, I said. We didn't stop until morning. When we did, it was in a wide, quiet pound with no nearby access points. I set snares along the bank while Ellie rested, and Moss patrolled like he'd been born to it. The next days blurred into a careful, exhausted routine. Ellie's ankle improved slowly, swelling receding, pain dulling to a constant ache. She learned to move with a crutch I'd fashioned from a broken oar, stubbornly refusing to be dead weight. I started thinking long-term again, not just surviving the week, but the winter, the years. The canals offered one thing roads never could: choke points we could control. Locks could be barricaded, bridges watched. A moving home meant we could abandon a place the moment it became unsafe. We just needed somewhere to reset. We found it near an old aqueduct in the Midlands, stone arches spanning a shallow valley, canal elevated high above the ground. No easy way up. Clear sight lines for hundreds of meters in both directions. Water deep enough to discourage the dead from climbing out easily. "This is good," Ellie said, eyes scanning the landscape. "This is very good." We spent a week there, cautiously. We strung lines with hanging tins along the towpath approaches. We cleared nearby bodies from the water with poles, pushing them off into the valley below. We slept in shifts, but we slept for the first time we talked about before. I told her why I'd chosen the canals originally. Burnout, noise, a life that felt too fast. She told me about her partner, Sam, and the lock where everything went wrong. We didn't dwell on it, just enough to acknowledge that those lives had been real. Winter deepened into something brutal. Snow fell thick and heavy, muffling the world. The canal froze solid in places, thick enough that even the dead could cross without breaking through. That scared me more than anything. The aqueduct became a bridge not just for us. They came one morning at dawn, drawn by something we couldn't control. Maybe smell, maybe sound carried on the wind. A dozen at first, then more, spilling onto the aqueduct from both sides. Ellie fired arrows carefully, each one placed with lethal precision. I used the boat hook, knocking them back into the frozen canal, where the ice cracked and swallowed them. Moss barked furiously, darting forward and back. But the ice held longer than it should have. One reached the boat, then another. Hands clawed at the hull, teeth scraped steel. I fired my last flare into the far end of the aqueduct. It burst into white-hot light, hissing and spitting. The dead turned toward it as one, drawn irresistibly. "Now!" Ellie shouted. I started the engine and rammed through the thinning ice, pushing past the last of them. One fell under the hull, another clung briefly before losing grip and vanishing beneath the red glow of the flare. We escaped again. But as the aqueduct receded behind us, I knew something fundamental had changed. The canals were no longer empty backroads. They were becoming arteries again, filled with the dead, with survivors, with conflict. Word spread. People followed water, always had. That night, Ellie sat beside me on the stern, ankle-wrapped bow across her knees. "We can't just keep running," she said. I stared out at the frozen water, at our reflection broken by cracks in the ice. I agreed. Sooner or later, we'll have to choose a place and hold it. The canal stretched ahead of us, winding south toward London, toward the densest, most dangerous convergence of waterways in the country, and toward an ending I could feel tightening around us, slow and inevitable as winter itself. London announced itself long before we saw it. The canals grew busier not with life, but with evidence of it. Boats lay abandoned in clusters, rammed together at awkward angles. Some were burned down to blackened shells, others stripped clean, doors hanging open like ribs pried apart. The water itself changed, carrying a sour, metallic smell that clung to the back of the throat. Ellie was walking better now, still stiff but mobile. Moss stayed close, hackles lifting more often the nearer we crept to the city's veins. The Grand Union Canal pulled us in like gravity. Feeder canals branched off in every direction, converging toward the capital. It was exactly what I'd feared. The water had become a funnel, and everything dead and living was being drawn toward the same narrow arteries. We began seeing signs of organization. Painted arrows on brickwork, ropes stretched across narrow sections of canal as makeshift barriers, bodies arranged deliberately at junctions, warnings as much as traps. Someone, or several someones, had claimed territory. "We turn back," I said one evening, as we moored beneath a railway bridge thick with soot and shadows. Ellie shook her head slowly. "We're low on fuel, low on food, and winter's not done with us yet." She was right. Turning back meant retreading ground that would only grow more dangerous as others followed. London, for all its horrors, also meant resources, warehouses, depots, places where supplies had once flowed in abundance. And it meant people. People we might have to fight. We pushed on. At a broad basin near the edge of the city, we encountered the flotilla. 6 narrowboats, lashed together side by side, forming a floating wall across the canal. Tarps stretched between them, stoves smoking, movement visible everywhere. Armed figures watched from decks and roofs, weapons casual but ready. A man hailed us through a megaphone. "Cut your engine. Drift forward slow." Ellie and I exchanged a look. We did as told. They boarded us with practiced efficiency, 2 from the bow, 1 from the stern. They checked compartments, counted supplies, eyes lingering a little too long on Ellie, on Moss. "You're lucky," the man said finally. He was tall, clean-shaven, wearing a high-vis jacket, like a badge of authority. "We're recruiting." "We're not joining," Ellie replied flatly. He smiled thinly. "Everyone joins, one way or another." They took fuel, food, tools, left us just enough to move. When they stepped back onto their boats, the man leaned close. "You try to run our stretch again without permission," he said quietly. "We sink you." The flotilla parted, letting us through like a closing throat. We didn't speak until they were far behind us. "That's the future," Ellie said at last. "Warlords on water." "Then we don't let it be ours," I replied. We moved at night after that. Lights out, engine barely above a whisper. We avoided main junctions, hugging neglected spurs and dead-end basins. Once, we drifted silently past a horde clustered at a waterside market, bodies piled 3 deep against locked gates, arms reaching through broken glass. Another time, we heard singing human voices echoing under a bridge. We didn't investigate. The end came faster than I expected. It was a cold, clear morning near Little Venice, canals splitting and rejoining in a confusing braid. Ice glazed the surface again, thinner now, treacherous. We rounded a bend and saw the blockage too late. A sunken boat lay crosswise ahead, deliberately scuttled. Chains stretched from its roof to the banks on both sides, and beyond it, movement. Dozens of the dead clustered on the ice, trapped but restless. Ellie swore, "It's a kill zone." Gunshots cracked from the bank. The first round punched through the cabin wall, missing my head by inches. I slammed the throttle forward, trying to ram the wreck, but the ice shattered unevenly, throwing the boat sideways. Another shot. Then shouting. People emerged from cover 5, maybe 6, armed and coordinated. Behind us, more shapes stirred, drawn by the noise. "We're boxed," Ellie said, already knocking an arrow. I saw it then. A narrow side channel to the right, half choked with ice and debris, barely wide enough for gray heron. Insane. Dangerous. "Hold on," I said. I yanked the tiller and gunned the engine. The boat scraped, screamed, steel grinding against submerged rubble. Ice shattered, water flooding the bow deck. A bullet shattered the front window. Moss barked wildly. Ellie fired one arrow, then another, dropping 2 of them on the bank. The dead surged forward, ice breaking under their weight as several plunged into the water, clawing, dragging others with them. The channel narrowed further. Something struck the hull hard enough to throw me off balance. Water poured in through a split seam near the bow. "Taking on water!" Ellie shouted. The engine coughed. "Not now," I begged it, slamming the throttle again. The channel opened suddenly into a small, overgrown basin, a forgotten turning point. I spun the boat, using momentum I didn't know we had left, and rammed it straight into the far bank. "Out!" I shouted. "Grab what you can." We leapt ashore as the dead spilled into the basin behind us, drawn by sound and motion. The boat listed badly, water sloshing inside, engine sputtering one last time before dying. Ellie stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring at gray heron. Then the first dead hand broke the surface. I grabbed her and ran. We fled into the trees as the basin filled with bodies, the canal claiming my home inch by inch. From the rise beyond, I looked back just in time to see gray heron slip beneath the surface, bubbles rising gently, like a final, quiet breath. I dropped to my knees, grief sharp and sudden. Ellie rested a hand on my shoulder. Moss leaned into my side. The canals had carried us across a dead country. They had given us time, choices. Now they had taken their due. But we were still alive. And as the sun rose over a broken city and the dead churned the water below, I knew the ending hadn't come yet. It had only changed shape. Losing gray heron felt like losing a limb. I kept reaching for her in my head, calculating distances, thinking in locks and pounds, listening for an engine that wasn't there anymore. The canals had been more than transport. They'd been structure, boundaries, a way to keep the world narrow enough to survive. On foot, everything sprawled. We moved west through parkland and derelict streets, keeping to green corridors where we could. Moss ranged ahead, silent now. No longer the cheerful dog I'd first unclipped from a bollard, but something leaner and sharper. Ellie walked with a grim determination, ankle wrapped tight, bow slung across her back, quiver lighter than I liked. London was dying loudly. Fires burned unchecked in pockets. Smoke drifted between tower blocks like low cloud. The dead were everywhere, sometimes clustered in vast, unmoving groups, sometimes roaming singly, endlessly persistent. Worse were the living. We skirted barricades and watch points, avoided voices, froze whenever we heard human laughter. Laughter had become a warning sound. On the 3rd day, we found another canal. The Regent's Canal curved ahead of us, water dull and sluggish. hemmed in by brick and steel, and moored against a crumbling wharf, half hidden beneath tarps and camouflage netting, was a narrowboat. Alive, smoke rose thin and controlled from its chimney. Lines had been set along the towpath, trip alarms fashioned from wire and scrap. Whoever lived here knew what they were doing. Ellie crouched beside me behind a collapsed wall. We risk it? I looked at the water, at the boat, at the dead shuffling aimlessly 100 meters away, stopped only by habit from falling in. We don't have many risks left, I said. We announced ourselves loudly but carefully, hands visible. It took a long minute before a woman's voice answered from the boat. Drop your weapons. Ellie and I exchanged a look, then did as told. They took us in 3 people, hard-eyed and exhausted. A small crew who'd turned the canal into a fortress, sinking boats at both ends of their stretch, using the water as a moat. They had food, fuel, rain catchment, a system. We don't take in strays, their leader said. Her name was Ruth. Not anymore. Ellie met her gaze without flinching. We're not strays. We're boaters. That earned a flicker of interest. I told them about the flotilla, about the traps, about how the canals were changing. Ruth listened in silence. By nightfall, they'd made their decision. We're moving, Ruth said, heading north. The city's done. Too many people, too many dead. She studied us. You know the water. You can help, or you can walk away. I looked at Ellie, at Moss, at the canal stretching away into darkness. I'm done walking, I said. The next week was the hardest of my life. We raised the sunken boats, blocking the canal, just enough to force a narrow, controlled passage. We fought twice with the dead as they poured toward the noise. I killed my first one up close with a hammer, the impact shuddering up my arms, the reality of it changing something inside me forever. Ellie saved my life when a living man tried to knife me during a night raid, her arrow taking him clean through the throat. She didn't celebrate. She just wiped the blood from her hands and sat shaking until Moss pressed his head into her chest. When we finally moved, pushing the narrowboat out into the open canal with a small convoy of scavenged craft, it felt like reclaiming something sacred. The engine's vibration under my feet was almost painful in its familiarity. The flotilla found us 2 days later. They came at dawn, engines roaring, weapons raised. The canal narrowed ahead, just as we'd planned. Sunken boats forced them into single file. The dead, drawn by noise and motion, surged from both banks. Ruth gave the signal. We dropped the final barrier, a chained cruiser held in place by a single cable. It fell into the water with a thunderous splash, blocking retreat. The flotilla slammed to a halt. The dead poured in. Screams echoed off brick and water. Gunshots cracked, then faltered. Boats caught fire, smoke boiling upward. The canal became chaos, living and dead tangled together, water churning with bodies. Ellie and I held the rear, arrows and bullets finding targets with grim efficiency. Moss barked wildly, darting between legs, snapping at anything that fell too close. The leader in the high-vis jacket spotted us across the water. Rage twisted his face. He tried to push his way forward, only to be dragged down by 6 grasping hands. He vanished beneath the surface, still fighting. It ended as suddenly as it began. The canal fell quiet again, broken only by the crackle of fire and the soft splash of bodies sinking. We didn't cheer. We just stood there, breathing hard, watching the water carry the past away. Weeks later, we reached open countryside again. Fewer boats, fewer people. The canals widened, gentler now, as if the land itself was exhaling. We chose a place near a junction of quiet waterways, defensible, fertile, forgotten. We repaired locks instead of breaking them, We cleared bodies instead of using them. Others came, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. I took the tiller one evening as the sun set gold over the water. Ellie sat beside me, ankle healed, bow resting easy across her lap. Moss lay at our feet, old scars hidden beneath thickened fur. The canal stretched ahead, calm and patient. The world had ended. But here, on this thin ribbon of water, something else had begun. And this time, we intended to hold it. Winter gave way to spring, though it came slowly. Ice thinned, thawed, and ran in sluggish rivers beneath broken bridges. The countryside woke around us, birds returning, small animals scurrying along the banks. The smell of wet earth replaced the stench of death. It was a small mercy, but a cruel one. It reminded us how much had changed, how fragile survival remained. Our settlement along the junction of quiet canals became a careful ecosystem. Boats moored in orderly fashion, cleared and repaired. We built simple barricades. Not to keep the world out entirely, it was too vast for that, but to slow it, to create warning points. Moss patrolled constantly, ears twitching, teeth ready. Ellie and I taught newcomers to move quietly, to read the water, to trust the canal in ways only we had learned. I spent hours on the tiller each day, watching the water. I studied every lock, every bend, every subtle change in current. Gray Heron was gone, swallowed by the canals, but I carried her in my muscle memory. Steering boats became instinct again, my mind tracing routes like veins, mapping escape and defense simultaneously. Ellie was remarkable in ways that still surprised me. She healed completely, then became almost untouchable with the bow. We practiced together, silent but efficient, and slowly she started leading supply runs herself. Her confidence restored a balance I didn't realize I'd lost after months of constant flight. The living threat never went away. Raiders appeared periodically, drawn by smoke or sight of our small flotilla. Each encounter tested our discipline, our patience, our judgment. We learned when to fight and when to mislead. Sometimes using the dead to slow pursuit, always staying one step ahead. Each skirmish hardened us, teaching that survival was as much mental as physical. One morning, as dawn burned pink across the water, Ellie and I stood on the bank, watching the canal stretch northward. Moss padded between us, sniffing the early blooms along the towpath. "We've lasted this long," she said softly. "It's almost like normal." "Normal doesn't exist anymore," I replied. "But something like it, maybe. We've carved it out." The sun rose fully, light spilling over water and banks, glinting on steel hulls and the faint ripples left by fish that somehow persisted beneath the surface. Life, stubborn and small, thrived in the shadow of death. And then it happened, the moment I had been waiting for, the culmination of every mile, every lock, every desperate choice along the canals. From the opposite bank of the junction, a single narrowboat appeared. Slow, deliberate. The prow painted with a faded symbol I recognized instantly. Gray Heron. No, she couldn't be. But as the boat glided closer, I saw that it had been repaired, restored by someone with skill and determination. A survivor like me, perhaps another who had remembered what mattered, who had refused to let her slip entirely into the past. Ellie stepped beside me, hand on my shoulder. Moss growled once, then relaxed as the boat drew level with our mooring. The boat came to a stop, the hatch opened, and a figure emerged, older, hardened, but alive. Someone who understood the water, its moods, its mercy, and its danger. They held out a hand across the canal, and I realized what it meant. Connection, alliance, perhaps even hope for rebuilding. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the narrow gap between past and present, loss and continuity, death and life. Ellie followed silently, Bo resting on her back, moss padded at our heels. The canals had been our refuge, our prison, our lifeline. They had tested us relentlessly, stripped us to bone and instinct, carried us across a dead country. And now, standing here, I understood that the water also held the future. I gripped the bow of the boat in front of me, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt truly steady. The world had ended, but we, Ellie, Moss, the people who had chosen to stay, and even those who returned, had begun again. And in the quiet of the early morning, with the water stretching endlessly ahead, I knew one thing for certain. We would hold it. The canals were ours now, and we were alive.